Rose Day always felt quieter than people thought. Not loud like Valentine's Day, not performative. It was the day that depended entirely on intention. I woke up early that morning without an alarm. The light outside was pale, almost hesitant, like it wasn't sure if winter was done with us yet. I lay still for a moment, listening to the house settle, listening for footsteps that never came. I remember thinking how strange it was that something as small as a single rose could carry so much weight. Expectation does that. It makes objects heavier. I had already chosen them the night before. Not red, too obvious. Soft pink, clean stems, no thorns left untouched. I told myself that details mattered, that effort mattered, that today would be simple. I showered slower than usual, replaying the same lines in my head. Not dramatic words, not emotional speeches, just something honest, something warm, something that would fit inside a quiet moment between two people who had already promised each other a life. He used to say he liked quiet days like this. I wondered when that stopped being true. I placed the roses carefully on the kitchen counter, away from direct light, like they needed protection. I even trimmed the stems again, unnecessarily, just to feel like I was doing something right. He had said we'd meet in the afternoon. Not a time, just after lunch. That should have bothered me. It didn't, because on Rose Day, you don't prepare for doubt. I dressed with intention. Nothing new, nothing loud. Something I knew he liked because he once said it made me look settled. At the time, I thought that was a compliment. I checked my phone. No messages yet. I told myself it was fine. By late morning, the house felt unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of every small sound. The refrigerator clicking on, a car passing outside, my own footsteps moving from room to room. I picked up the roses once, then set them back down. I didn't want to bruise them. Around noon, I received a message. Running a little behind today. Nothing else. No apology, no explanation, just behind. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. He usually sent voice notes when he was late, short, casual explanations I could hear between meetings. This time there was only text. I placed the phone face down on the table, like if I couldn't see it, it couldn't change the day. I told myself delays happen. Work runs long, meetings overlap. That's what adults do. They rationalize before they react. By early afternoon, the light shifted. The roses leaned slightly toward the window. I adjusted the ribbon around the stems, smoothing it carefully as if the presentation itself might still matter. I reheated coffee I didn't finish. The mug stayed warm longer than the room did. At one point, I even laughed quietly at myself. This wasn't a big deal. It was just a rose. Except it wasn't. Rose Day had always meant something specific to me. Not romance for display, but recognition. A pause. A small acknowledgement that someone sees you. Not in grand gestures, but in intention. That's why I waited. Another message came in, hours later. Can we talk later? Later. Always later. I didn't respond right away. Not because I was upset, but because something subtle had shifted inside me. Not pain, not anger, just a quiet misalignment, like a picture frame slightly crooked on a wall you've walked past every day. I looked at the roses again. They were still perfect. I finally decided I'd step outside, maybe clear my head, maybe take the flowers with me. Waiting had begun to feel heavier than moving. That's when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. The sound startled me enough that I nearly dropped the vase. Water sloshed against the glass, a few drops spilling on my hand. I set the roses down quickly and went to the door. There was no one standing there. Just an envelope. Thick. Official. My name typed cleanly across the front. For a moment, I honestly thought it was a mistake. Something misdelivered, someone else's paperwork. But my address was correct. My full legal name. I stood there longer than necessary, holding it. I couldn't explain why my chest tightened when I looked at it, like my body recognized something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. Rose Day isn't a day you associate with paperwork or formality or anything that feels cold and institutional. I placed the envelope on the counter, deliberately, next to the roses. The contrast felt wrong. I told myself I would read it later, after we talked, after the day made sense again. I checked my phone once more. Nothing. I remember noticing how quiet my breathing was, how calm I felt, strangely, as if my body was waiting for instructions my mind hadn't given yet. I sat down at the table, facing the roses, the envelope just within reach. Two objects, two futures. I still didn't open it. Instead, I waited. Because on Rose Day, you don't assume betrayal. You assume misunderstanding. I told myself that whatever was inside that envelope could wait, that today wasn't the day for seriousness, that today was meant for something softer. I lifted the roses again, feeling the cool glass against my fingers, reminding myself that I had done nothing wrong by hoping. That was when my phone finally rang. Not a call from him, an unfamiliar number. I let it ring. Somewhere beneath the quiet surface of that afternoon, something administrative, something procedural, something that did not care about flowers or intention or waiting. I didn't know it yet. All I knew was that I was standing in my kitchen on Rose Day, holding flowers I had chosen with care, still believing the day would turn out the way it was supposed to. I had no idea that while I waited with roses in my hands, a file with my name on it had already been opened. I didn't know it yet, but the system had already started moving without asking me. Rose Day officially ended at midnight. I know because I checked the clock without meaning to. 11:58 p.m. Then 12:01. I didn't feel dramatic about it. I didn't cry. I didn't pace the room. I just noticed how quiet everything became once the day crossed over and nothing had arrived with it. No knock, no message that explained anything clearly, no apologies shaped like effort. The roses were still fresh. That surprised me. I had expected them to droop the way I felt inside, but they didn't. They stayed upright, almost disciplined, like they were still waiting for instructions. I rinsed the glasses, wiped the counter, and put the vase back exactly where it had been all day. There's something grounding about finishing small tasks when your thoughts don't want to stay still. I told myself this wasn't disappointment yet. It was just misalignment. That happens in marriages. Schedules slide, days get crowded. Still, something felt off in a way I couldn't name. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the calm. Not peace, calm. The kind that comes when your body has already accepted something your mind hasn't finished processing. There was a message on my phone, sent at 1:17 a.m. Sorry, long day. We'll talk tomorrow. No mention of the roses, no acknowledgement of the day, no curiosity about how I'd spent the evening he knew I'd planned around him. I didn't respond, not out of anger, out of instinct. Something in me wanted to see what would happen if I didn't fill the silence for him. By noon, I had done something else I didn't plan to do. I checked his public calendar. We share access for practical reasons: meetings, travel, family obligations. It's something we agreed on years ago to avoid misunderstandings. There was a block of time on Rose Day evening marked personal. That wasn't unusual either. What was unusual was the timestamp. It had been added retroactively. The edit history showed it hadn't been there when I checked that morning. That detail sat with me longer than it should have. Later that afternoon, a package arrived. Not large, not urgent looking. Standard envelope, my full legal name printed neatly, no handwriting. The return address was a downtown office building I recognized, but couldn't immediately place. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the table next to the roses and noticed how strange they looked together. One was soft, intentional, meant to be held. The other was flat, official, meant to be processed. They didn't belong in the same frame. When I finally opened the envelope, I read it slowly, not because it was hard to understand, because I wanted to be sure my reaction wasn't exaggerating its meaning. It was a notice, procedural, neutral in tone, informational. My name had been included in a filing. Not a judgment, not a summons, a file initiation. The date at the top made my chest tighten for the first time. February 14, Valentine's Day, a full week after Rose Day, which meant this hadn't been created in response to anything that happened between us. It had been prepared while I was still standing in the kitchen arranging flowers. I sat down without realizing I was about to. There's a particular kind of hurt that doesn't feel emotional at first. It feels administrative, like realizing someone has made plans about you without including you and did it carefully. That night, he came home late again. Not unusually late, just late enough to make explanations unnecessary. He kissed my cheek, asked how my day was, glanced briefly at the roses like they were decor he'd seen before. I watched him the way you watch a familiar road after a sign changes. Same surface, different meaning. He mentioned a meeting that hadn't been on the calendar earlier, gave a reason that sounded reasonable, said my name in the middle of the sentence the way people do when they're trying to anchor themselves to sincerity. I nodded, I listened, I didn't interrupt. Later, after he'd fallen asleep, I reread the notice. This time, I focused on details instead of implications. File number, office department, reference language that suggested prior documentation. One line stood out, not because it was alarming, but because it was specific. Supporting records previously submitted. Plural. I hadn't submitted anything. Over the next 2 days, small things continued to surface. Not evidence, signals. A delayed bank notification that arrived 48 hours after a routine transaction. A voicemail time-stamped earlier than the call log suggested. A name on the notice that appeared again in a completely different context when I searched it casually online. None of it screamed betrayal. That's what made it worse. It felt organized. I didn't ask him questions, not because I was afraid of the answers, but because I didn't want to alert him to the fact that I had started counting. By the end of the week, I understood something clearly, even if I didn't understand everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding between two people who loved each other. This was a structure being built quietly, while I was still standing in the doorway with flowers, believing timing was the only thing that had gone wrong. I placed the notice back in its envelope, slid it into a folder, and wrote the date on the tab, not as an accusation, as a record. And for the first time since Rose Day, I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt alert. By the time Rose Day passed, nothing dramatic had happened. That was the part most people don't understand. There was no confrontation, no late-night argument, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. What happened instead was quieter and much more unsettling. The roses dried slowly on the kitchen counter. I didn't throw them away. I didn't move them either. I just let them exist where they were, the way I let unanswered questions exist in my head. Every time I passed by, I noticed something different. A petal curling inward, the water level dropping, the stems bending slightly out of shape. It felt like a timeline I hadn't agreed to, but was now part of. I started paying attention to time in a way I never had before. Not emotionally, logistically. I noticed the Rose Day card receipt was time-stamped at 11:42 a.m. I noticed his message saying he'd be running late came in at 2:18 p.m. I noticed the official envelope, the one I hadn't opened yet, had been scanned into the building's mail system at 9:06 a.m. that same morning. Before the roses, before the waiting, before I even knew I was supposed to be confused. That detail stayed with me. So did others. I didn't accuse him. I didn't ask questions that would lead to rehearsed answers. I'd learned, without realizing it, that clarity doesn't come from conversations with people who are already ahead of you. It comes from records. I opened the envelope 2 days later on a Wednesday evening, after dinner, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted my body to be calm when my mind processed it. Inside were copies, not originals. That mattered. The document referenced a filing date from the week before Rose Day. It wasn't dramatic, just procedural language. My name typed cleanly, my address correct, my marriage referenced without emotion, as if it were a technical detail. There was no explanation attached, no note, no warning, just the quiet confidence of something that assumed it didn't need my reaction to continue existing. That was when I realized something important. This wasn't about love anymore. This was about truth, and truth leaves patterns. I didn't spiral, I organized. I pulled out a notebook, not a diary, not something emotional, just lined paper. I wrote the dates down the way they appeared, not the way they felt. Rose Day went on the list, so did the filing date, so did the timestamps from my phone. Then I added his travel calendar, then his bank alerts, the ones we'd always shared access to out of convenience. There was nothing explosive, no single moment that screamed betrayal, but there was alignment. Withdrawals that matched days he'd said he was tied up, appointments that overlapped with times I'd been waiting, names I didn't recognize appearing more than once, spelled the same way every time. That consistency bothered me more than chaos would have. I reread the document slowly, noticing what it didn't say. No personal observations, no recent evaluations, no acknowledgement of current context. Everything referenced older material, phrases that felt borrowed, not lived in. I checked one name in the footer, a professional listed as active. A quick search showed the license had expired years earlier, not revoked, just expired. That kind of detail doesn't scream fraud, it whispers negligence, and negligence only happens when someone thinks they won't be questioned. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not friends, not family, especially not him. From the outside, nothing changed. I still went to work, I still answered messages normally, I still asked how his day was. But internally, something had shifted. I stopped interpreting, I started verifying. I created a simple timeline, nothing fancy, just dates on the left, actions on the right. No commentary, no emotional language, facts only. The more I added, the clearer it became. Rose Day hadn't been forgotten, it had been scheduled around. That realization landed without anger, without sadness, just awareness. I remembered how he used to say he appreciated predictability, how he liked knowing where things were headed. At the time, I thought he meant stability. Now I understood it differently. Predictability makes systems easier to move through. It makes paperwork smoother. It makes silence look cooperative. I reviewed the document again, slower this time. One reference stood out, a supporting note dated after a transaction I knew had happened earlier, not emotionally earlier, chronologically earlier, by weeks. That wasn't a feeling, that was impossible. I checked again, I checked the numbering, I checked the formatting. Everything else matched, except that one line. That document could not legally exist in that order. I didn't react right away. I let that realization sit. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to understand how far it went. Patterns don't reveal themselves all at once. They repeat until you're calm enough to see them. The roses were completely dry by then. I finally moved them, not to throw them away, but to place them somewhere intentional. I trimmed the stems and set them in an empty vase on the shelf, not as decoration, but as a marker. That was the day I stopped waiting, not for answers, for alignment. I knew quietly that whatever came next wouldn't be emotional, it would be procedural, and I was ready for that. By the time I realized how many pieces were already in motion, I understood something important. I hadn't started anything. I had only stopped standing in the way of the truth. The first call came 3 days after the envelope. It wasn't dramatic, no raised voices, no accusations, just a calm female voice asking if I was available to confirm my full legal name. She didn't say why at first. She didn't need to. The moment she pronounced my name correctly, first, middle, last, I felt that same tightness in my chest again, that quiet signal my body kept sending before my mind caught up. She explained her role carefully. Administrative, procedural, neutral. Words that meant she wasn't on my side or his side. She was on the side of records. And records, I was learning, don't care how romantic a story sounds. She asked me if I had access to shared financial accounts, if I recognized certain dates, if I had signed anything digitally in the last 6 months. Each question landed gently, but together they formed a shape I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. After the call, I didn't cry. That surprised me. Instead, I made coffee and sat at the table, staring at the steam rising from the mug the same way I had on Rose Day. Only this time, I wasn't waiting. I opened the folder I had started without realizing it was becoming evidence. At first, it had just been screenshots, messages, calendar reminders he never showed up for. But now I saw them differently. The late nights aligned with unexplained charges. The weekends he claimed were work emergencies matched hotel confirmations I had never noticed before. I remembered how he used to say he liked quiet days like this. I wondered when that stopped being true, or if it ever was. The most unsettling part wasn't what I found, it was how easy it was to find once I stopped protecting him from my own questions. Another call came the next morning. This time they asked me to forward documents. They didn't rush me, they didn't pressure me, they simply told me where to send them. That was when I understood something else. Systems don't seduce you, they don't promise forever, they don't bring roses, they just wait for accuracy. As I scanned and uploaded files, I noticed how steady my hands were. No shaking, no hesitation. I wasn't angry, I was precise. Later that evening, he finally called. Not a voice note, an actual call. His voice sounded familiar in the way old habits do, recognizable but no longer comforting. He asked why I sounded distant, why I was being formal. I didn't explain. For the first time, I didn't translate my silence into reassurance for him. I told him I was busy, which was true. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room and replayed the call in my head. He hadn't asked if I was okay. He hadn't asked if something was wrong. He had asked why I was different. That question answered more than anything else had. 2 days later, a third message arrived. Not from him, from an office. This one referenced files by number, not by feeling. It mentioned discrepancies, overlaps, unaccounted signatures, language that didn't accuse but didn't ignore either. I read it twice, then a third time, and finally I allowed myself to say it out loud. Oh. That was the moment the story stopped being about what he did to me and became about what was about to happen because of what he did. I closed the laptop and stood by the window, watching the streetlights come on one by one. People walked past with flowers, with plans, with assumptions. I wondered how many of them believed love was enough to protect them from paperwork. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, because even though nothing had officially ended yet, nothing had officially begun either, the system was no longer waiting, and this time, it wasn't moving in his favor. I did not sit in the courtroom expecting anything dramatic. By the time we reached that morning, drama had already lost its meaning to me. Everything loud had already happened somewhere else, in paperwork, in signatures, in decisions made without my presence. What remained now was simply process. The judge read quietly, longer than before. No one interrupted him this time. I watched the way my husband sat 2 seats away from me. Not angry, not scared, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when someone realizes the story they prepared will not be the one being told. My attorney didn't speak much either. He didn't need to. The documents were already in the record. Dates aligned. Bank activity explained itself. The filing timeline no longer needed interpretation. It spoke plainly. When the judge finally looked up, his voice was steady. The petition was denied. No raised tone, no lecture, just a clean sentence that closed something that had been trying to stay open. Temporary restrictions were lifted immediately. Control over my accounts was restored. Any further action, he said, would require independent review. Not assumptions, not family claims, not selective medical language. There was a pause after that. Not the awkward kind, the kind where a system finishes one task and prepares for the next. He added one more thing, almost as an afterthought. The court would be forwarding certain inconsistencies to the appropriate department for review. Routine, procedural, necessary. That was it. No one looked at me for a reaction. I didn't give one anyway. I simply nodded when my attorney leaned over and whispered that we were done. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt brighter than it had weeks ago. Not because something wonderful had happened, but because something false had stopped happening. I didn't wait around. I signed what I needed to sign, collected what was returned to me, listened carefully as my attorney explained next steps, timelines, and what not to do. He spoke in weeks and checklists. I appreciated that. It felt honest. When I stepped outside, the air was cold but clear. It was still Rose Day. I realized that when I noticed a woman walking past the courthouse holding a small bouquet wrapped in brown paper. Red roses, simple ones, probably bought quickly, probably meant for someone who was late. For a moment, I remembered myself that morning, standing in my kitchen, trimming the stems, checking the time, rehearsing a sentence I didn't end up meeting. I remembered how carefully I had chosen the roses. Not too many, not dramatic, just enough to say I was still trying. I didn't feel embarrassed by that memory. I felt proud of it, because loving sincerely is not a mistake. Believing someone is not weakness. Waiting with flowers is not foolish when it comes from a place of honesty. What mattered was what I did when the waiting ended. Over the next few weeks, things settled the way things do when no one is forcing them anymore. My accounts normalized. Notifications stopped arriving at odd hours. Letters came addressed to me, not around me. I moved my things quietly, changed routines, and learned the difference between privacy and secrecy. There were no confrontations. We spoke only when required, briefly, clearly, without emotion attached. That surprised him more than anger ever could have. I didn't need explanations. The records had already given me the clearest one. The marriage didn't end in a dramatic moment. It ended in alignment, when my reality finally matched what had been happening behind my back. Some evenings I still made tea at the same time I used to. The habit stayed, even when the reason didn't. I found comfort in that. It reminded me that not everything needs to be erased to move forward. On paper, the outcome was simple: a denied petition, restored autonomy, a closed file. But personally, it felt like something else. It felt like getting my name back. Not the version attached to evaluations or assumptions or quiet strategies. Just my name, attached to my choices, my timing, my future. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post anything. I didn't explain myself to people who hadn't asked. I just lived differently. On the next Rose Day, a year later, I noticed something unexpected. I didn't avoid the flower section. I stood there longer than I thought I would, looked at the colors, the prices, the way people hovered, unsure, hoping someone would notice the gesture. I bought a single rose, not red, pale pink. I took it home, placed it in a glass on my kitchen counter, and went about my day. This time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to arrive. I wasn't rehearsing words. I wasn't watching the clock. The rose wasn't a question anymore. It was a reminder that love doesn't disappear when it's mishandled by someone else. It just stops being offered where it's not respected. That systems can be abused, but they can also correct themselves when you stay calm long enough to let the truth line up. And that sometimes the strongest thing you can do on a day meant for romance is choose clarity, quietly.